Hey everybody, this is Jared Marler with the Blue and Gray Education Society here with another installment of our Civil War 101 series. And I am really excited tonight because we get a chance to talk to one of my favorite Civil War authors, and that is Mr. Dave Powell. Dave, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Jared.
Well, like I said, Dave is one of my favorite authors. I could spend this whole time talking about his other books, but we're going to focus on his new one, The Atlanta Campaign, which I've got here, or the Atlanta Campaign Volume 1, excuse me.
hmm
But before we do a deep dive into that, Dave, could you do a little introduction of yourself? Tell us who you are and how you got into the Civil War studies.
Sure. My name is David Powell. Um, I first became fascinated with the Civil War in grade school. My father had an interest in history, took me to Gettysburg, took me to a couple of other places. Um, I'm a war gamer from the 1970s era, so I discovered board games and historical board games and fell in love with those. And in 1979, I went to VMI, Virginia Military Institute. That furthered the interest in the American Civil War, and I, I've just been fascinated by all facets of the Civil War since then. About 2009, I started to my first book came out. I started to get seriously interested in writing about the war, um, um, and I really haven't stopped since.
If you had to pick an aspect of the Civil War that's your favorite, I know you've written heavily on Chickamauga, now the Atlanta Campaign, but you've also touched some in the Shenandoah Valley. What's one of your favorite aspects of the Civil War? Favorite characters, battles?
Well, it's this might come as a shock. It's not quite so much geography or personality as it is. I'm interested in tactics. I'm interested in how the war was fought, the men who fought it, and how they struggled to deal with the tactical challenges that they faced in 1861-65. That's led me to, as you say, the Battle of Chickamauga, the second largest battle of the war, very confusing battle. It's also led me to the Shenandoah. I wanted to look at General Franz Sigel because there's a benefit in looking at the sort of the losing side, the less considered side. Um, and in my latest challenge, I think, is really to look at the Atlanta campaign in an in-depth way. I want to understand not just the big battles, and there are a number of big battles: Resaca, Kennesaw, um, Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, Jonesboro, etc. But there are also just the day-to-day grind and the tactical stuff that happens for the men in the ranks every day for those 112 days from May to the end of August, the beginning of September. So um, I would say, honestly, the most interested or the most the biggest hook for me is really that tactical stuff.
I understand, and trying to get into the heads of these guys, what they may have been thinking as these different obstacles approach, as battle lines may have changed, different positions may have changed, trying to get into their head. And like you said, we often think about the victors of it and what they did, to propel themselves and their men to victory, but we often don't think about the other side of the spectrum. What was going on, for Franz Sigel in the Shenandoah. What was going on, um, for John Bell Hood during the Atlanta campaign. So it's great that you're doing these deep dives into both sides, which is a fresh take on it. I think.
Well, thank you.
So, you mentioned that you've been writing since 2009. Could you tell us more about the other books you've written?
Well, in 2009, I published a book. I really had an opportunity the year before to uh, do a map study of the Battle of Chickamauga. Ted Savas Beatty, was beginning a series that's mostly continued with Professor Gottfried in the Eastern Theater, and he's done a number of books of a map and a tactical, a page of description. So yeah, for instance, the maps of Chattanooga and the maps of Chickamauga, I should say, is 144 pages of text and maps that that kind of take you through the battle in a graphical interface way. It's a different approach to the battle and to understanding the battle. The map series was really well received. Maps of Chickamauga was well received. It's still to this day a bestseller at Chickamauga Park. But it also got me into, was my foot in the door for writing a much more detailed series. And ultimately, I've written 6 books on Chickamauga. I've written the Chickamauga trilogy, which covers September 19th, September 20th, and the aftermath of 1863. Written a book called Decisions at Chickamauga, which focuses kind of like a staff ride on the decision-making process. Failure in the Saddle, which is a study of Confederate cavalry in the campaign. And then other subsequent to that, once I finished with Chickamauga, there were other opportunities. We did some Chattanooga stuff. I was happy to be asked to write a study of General Grant at Chattanooga for the Southern Illinois University Press called Impulse of Victory. We did a Tullahoma campaign study, which I co-authored with my good friend Eric Wittenberg, which I think is a great book. I hope more people turn to it over time. But eventually, all these paths led me. I could go from Chickamauga, 1863. That you can go backwards into 62, or you can go forwards in time into 1864. And I knew people were working on some really good stuff in Kentucky and Tennessee in 1862. So I decided to go forward into 1864 and the Atlanta campaign.
Right. And you've already answered my next question, was how did you go from Chickamauga, which, if you haven't read his 3-part book or 3-part series on Chickamauga, it is the seminal work, I think, of the campaign. But moving from there to Atlanta, I can see that transition now for you. So what goes into the process of starting into an in-depth study like this? Because I mean, this is volume 1. It's 500 pages, leading up to the battle. So how do you get started with that process? Like, what's step 1 for you in sitting down to write this?
Step 1 is really just accumulating material. There's a very good book. To this day, it's a very good book on the battle, or on the Atlanta campaign. It's Dr. Castell's Decision in the West. It was published in 1992. And honestly, if you read it today, you're going to be, I think, well informed. You're going to be pleasantly surprised. It holds up well. Castell was ahead of his time in many of his opinions, but what he could not do, because it's a 1-volume work covering essentially 4 months of campaign, is he couldn't go into a lot of detail. He couldn't really discuss the Battle of Resaca, for instance, in a lot of depth. Many of the voices of the campaign had to be sort of left on the cutting room floor. And The Atlanta campaign is rich in sources. We have, um, as I've done my research around the country, I've traveled around. We have just tons of material. It was a seminal experience for many of the soldiers, Confederate and Union, more so Union than Confederate. But it was so important, for their military careers and their military lives, that a vast number of them recorded their impressions of. So, in sort of setting out for this objective for this project, I had a couple of objectives. The first was to update the scholarship. Castell's book came out in '92, but not, not to denigrate that book. It still is a great book, as I've said, but there's a lot more recent scholarship, a lot more in-depth study on the Atlanta campaign or individual aspects of the campaign, and I wanted to bring those into the narrative. And I also wanted to cover a lot of the sort of forgotten material in depth. I wanted to really do a deep dive into Resaca, which is, when you think about it, the Battle of Resaca is fought May 14 and 15, 1864. We tend not to think of it as this huge Civil War battle, but it really did involve 140,000 soldiers and 80,000 Federals and about 60,000 Confederates. And it was a 2-day battle. There were attacks and counterattacks on both sides. There's a lot of nuance and complexity to it that I wanted to bring to it. And then finally, I really wanted to sort of emphasize and bring out some of the many veterans' voices that that just imbue the work. Well, you've read it. You know I quote a number of people, hundreds of people, and so I wanted to bring all that to the table. And the Atlanta campaign is just rich in sources. So my first, honestly, to take a step back, my first process in any project I gather, or any project I undertake rather, is to gather sources. And so usually 2, 3, 4 years before I start writing, I am collecting source material. And I have been to dozens of state archives, dozens of libraries, universities, just trying to bring in that material, to assimilate it all and to start reading through it and develop a sense of what's the story I'm ultimately going to tell.
And you're right. I mean, you quote hundreds of people in this book. It isn't just the top players. It isn't just the main generals that everybody tends to focus on. It's everybody from top to bottom. So let's dive into this book now. This came out, was it last month?
Yes.
Or we were recording this in August, so this came out in July of 2024 with Savas Beatty as the publisher. Like I said, it's a fantastic book. So take us through this story, because I know that the book is titled From Dalton to Cassville from May 1st through the 19th, 1864, but you actually start in February.
Yes.
So take us through that story without giving too much, because we still want folks to go out and buy this book.
Well, the prologue of the book starts in February 1864, because in reaction to Sherman's Meridian campaign in Mississippi, General Grant, who's a little concerned about Sherman because he kind of marches sort of off the radar. He's out of telegraphic communication, and Grant starts to get a little worried. And so Grant is urging George Thomas to strike at the army, the Confederate Army of Tennessee, which is based in Dalton, Georgia. And that's where the Confederates ended up after the battles of Chattanooga, Missionary Ridge, and Ringgold in November, really the end of November, beginning of December 1863. That is where the Federals begin or spend, I should say, the winter of 1863/4 in places like Ringgold, Chattanooga, Cleveland, Tennessee, Knoxville, and so there's sort of a precursor, a curtain raiser to the entire Atlantic campaign, which is conducted by George Thomas in February 1864. He moves on Dalton. He realizes that Dalton, Georgia, is largely protected by a terrain feature called Rocky Face Ridge, which is another one of these sort of succeeding mountain ridges that dominate North Georgia, and they're largely oriented to run north-south, and so they lay across the Federal advance, and it's the germinating seed of what will become Sherman's significant plan in May of 1864, when he decides he doesn't want to assault Dalton directly. He doesn't want to attempt to storm Rocky Face Ridge. Instead, he'll go around through a place called Snake Creek Gap and on to Resaca. And so I felt I had to do a preliminary discussion of that. That's the preface, because it reveals so much about what comes later. After that, I spent a lot of time on the strategy of the campaign and the decision making of the campaign. Both sides had issues about who was going to go where they were going to commit their forces. Both sides' plans changed a great deal over time, and I wanted to discuss that strategic framework fully before we got into the tactical aspects of it. There's really two important questions in the book. On the Union side, early on, Sherman wants to actually strike for a place called Rome, Georgia, which is a much more ambitious flanking movement than Snake Creek Gap and Resaca. And various circumstances, most especially the fact that too many of the federal forces are diverted elsewhere, and he doesn't have the strength to send his favorite army, the army of the Tennessee, the Union Army of the Tennessee under James V. McPherson, into to Rome because they're under strength, and he shortens its objectives and goes for Resaca instead. I actually, the more interesting strategic debate comes from the Confederate side of the equation, where Joseph E. Johnson, who's appointed to replace Braxton Bragg after the Confederate defeat at Missionary Ridge, Johnson advocates for sort of a defensive strategy, a Fabian strategy, some people have called it, to fall back to weaken Sherman. Conversely, in Richmond, Jefferson Davis and also Braxton Bragg, who has been subsequently appointed to command, or not command, advise Jefferson Davis in Richmond in the wake of the defeat at Missionary Ridge, a decision that raises a lot of eyebrows and causes a lot of consternation across the South. They want an offensive. Davis has always advocated for the offensive. You can go into 1862, 1863. Davis will always lean towards some form of offensive warfare. And it's no different in 1864. He's pushing Johnson to march through East Tennessee, move into Middle Tennessee around Nashville, and then strike north into Kentucky, even the Ohio River. Johnson, who inherits this army, realizes that fully understands that the Southern resources are constrained in 1864. It's not really an option anymore. And he struggles to make Davis understand that he can't do that. Now, the other aspect of this whole strategic debate is that Johnson is a terrible communicator. He's unable to articulate in a way that, say, Robert E. Lee, who is perhaps the master communicator of the American Civil War in terms of military political relationships. Lee's relationship with Davis is outstanding. Johnson has none of that. Johnson doesn't communicate well with Davis, rarely talks even to his own subordinates in terms of strategy and tactics. And so this disconnect that occurs between the two armies, or not the two armies, but the administration in Richmond and Johnson's tactical headquarters in Dalton, Georgia, is never resolved. It boils down to Johnson argues that I will retreat. You need to reinforce me because Sherman is going to be heavily reinforced, and we need to confront him with all our strength. And in Richmond, the argument is always, well, if you promise to conduct an offensive, if you go on the offensive, we will reinforce you. And Sherman and Johnson counters that I can't go on the offensive until you reinforce me. That debate is never resolved. They're still having that debate in the middle of the campaign. And when Leonidas Polk, who everybody likes to kick in the American Civil War, he's not one of the stellar heroes of Civil War historiography. And yet, Polk makes one of the most important decisions of the campaign right from the outset, when he is ordered to take as many troops as he thinks he can spare from Mississippi to reinforce Johnson in Georgia. Polk takes both of his infantry divisions plus whatever resources he can command from the Gulf Coast and a full cavalry division of 4,500 men. So he takes an immense amount of force, relatively speaking, and even as late as May, I think 19th, 20th, Richmond is going, why did you take all these troops? You weren't authorized to do that. And Polk argues back that, well, you authorized me to take as many forces as you think I could spare, and I think we have to spare all these forces. Arguably one of the unsung decisions of the American Civil War is Polk's decision to reinforce Georgia at the expense of Mississippi, over and above the thoughts of Bragg and Davis in Richmond. And when they call him on it, he responds, well, if you didn't want me to do that, you should have told me not to. It's too late now. But without those troops, I'm not sure that that Johnson could have conducted the campaign that he did.
Right. I totally agree. I mean, and you're right. Polk gets kicked around a lot. Especially for his actions at like Chickamauga, but he makes a great decision there. Let's see. I just want to do a quick plug for a second for the Blue and Gray Education Society. If you go
Sure.
to Rocky Face Ridge today, the Blue and Gray Education Society has placed cannons there, and at the park to make it more appealing and kind of what it may have part would have looked like there. But that's one of the projects that we recently completed. So just wanted to throw us in there for that since we were talking
You should.
about about
Yes.
Dalton.
The it takes an entire expanse of folks and organizations to kind of create these sites that we now embrace and come to rely on. And one of the places is Rocky Face Ridge, and the relocation of some cannon have greatly enhanced that site. So absolutely, BGES needs kudos.
And a special thanks to guys like Bob Jenkins, who has done a lot of history, especially around Resaca and Dalton and
Right.
that area. He's one of our treasured members. So in kind of wrapping this up, and unless you had any more you wanted to discuss about this.
Well, I will say the other thing I wanted to focus on in volume 1 was a more considered and detailed treatment of the Battle of Resaca. I mentioned earlier it's a very large battle, relatively speaking to numbers. It's not huge in terms of, say, Civil War casualties. It's not Antietam or Gettysburg or Chickamauga, but it's really the curtain raiser on the entire campaign. Joseph Johnson, whom history has largely said doesn't attack. Johnson is famous for launching 2 attacks in the American Civil War. The Seven Pines in 1862 and Bentonville in 1865. Johnson tries to launch 2 attacks at Resaca. There are nuances to this campaign that we overlook, that we miss, and Resaca is a big part of that. It's just starting to become a battlefield that we can enjoy and explore. Half of it is preserved as state land managed by the county. The other half is either in private hands still or partly protected through the work of the trust and the American Battlefield Trust and some other organizations. But its potential as over time as a large national military park is there. We could put that together if we wanted to, and I hope someday that we do. But I wanted to highlight the fight at Resaca in ways that no one has ever really done before. And so that's the other sort of centerpiece of this volume 1.
Right, and you're right. That's a very overlooked battle. I mean, people tend to focus on, like you said, the Atlanta portion of it, but it wouldn't have got there if it hadn't have been for battles like Resaca. So, I know that this book is published by Savas Beatty. Are all the rest of your books published by them as well?
Most of them are published by Savas Beatty.
Okay.
I have been published by Southern Illinois Press, by LSU, for some essay stuff, but I have Savas gave me my first break. They're my fondest people to work with. And I feel like I have the most flexibility with Savas Beatty. So all of these books will be published by Savas. In the future, who knows? But I have other projects that I want to pitch at them. So hopefully, yes.
So we will include a link so as to where to purchase this below from Savage Beatty, along with a way to access Dave's other books through them. So I guess the only question I have for you now is, when can we expect volume 2?
I estimate 4 chapters away from finishing the writing of volume 2 as we speak. So today is August 5th. In theory, by the end of September, this book will be done. That doesn't mean it's ready to publish.
Right.
There's the editorial process. But my goal is to make sure that we do a book a year, so that if you're a science fiction and fantasy fan, if you're a George R.R. Martin fan, the last book of his series, the Game of Thrones, is notoriously decades in the making. I don't want to do that. So I would, I'm confident that volume 2 will come out next year in 2025. We want to do the remaining 3 volumes in succeeding years, but I also want to do something akin to the Maps of Chickamauga, a Maps of Atlanta campaign, because I've had to draw a lot of maps just to teach myself the battle, or the campaign, the battles. And so we'll try and throw that into the mix too.
So if people, read this or read your Chickamauga trilogy and they say, "Hey, I want to walk the battlefields with Dave Powell," they can do that through the Blue and Gray Education Society. What are some tours that you lead? I know that you and I have done Chickamauga together, but what are some other tours that you lead?
Well, the one tour that I do, that I've been doing for 20 years now, and I'm doing it in conjunction with the park historian at Chickamauga, Jim Ogden, is, and as I tell people, I really started this just so I could follow Jim Ogden around on the battlefield, because there's no better experience in Civil War than that. Is every year in March, I do a seminar in the woods. Now, it's typically a Friday bus tour and then a Saturday battlefield walk, 2 battlefield walks. I tend not to publicize it a lot because it fills up quickly, and I only ever want to take 1 bus. If I get, I've done multi-bus tours where you have 2 motor coaches and 100 people or 110 people, and it's just logistically very difficult to do. You lose a lot of time loading and unloading and all this.
Right.
So, but I do, this year it's going to be March, I think 8th and 9th. I have to look at the calendar. It's the first Friday, Saturday, March. Well, in this case, it'd be the second Friday, Saturday of March. And then, I do tours when asked for, or tours or talks. We're going to be doing a series of BGES stuff over time, Blue Gray Education Society stuff over time. And we'll certainly explore the Atlanta campaign. In November, we're slated to explore Chattanooga. So we'll see what folks want to turn out there. I will say Chattanooga is a little more challenging than Chickamauga. Chickamauga is 5,400 acres of land we can walk around on. Chattanooga is shuttling to different sites. Can't really do a bus, can do a minivan or something.
Right.
But, pardon me. That said, Chattanooga is also very rewarding if you get a chance to get on the ground and look at the terrain. There's a lot of dramatic terrain: the Craven's House, Moccasin Bend, the Sherman Reservation on Missionary Ridge. there's a lot of just sort of spectacular terrain that we can explore. And there's more of that battlefield still around and still available that I think people don't necessarily understand. So,
Right. Well, if you want to go on a Blue and Gray tour, be sure to check out the Blue and Gray Education Society website and sign up for those tours with Dave. Like I said, we'll post a link to the Atlanta Campaign Volume 1 in the description below. Dave, thank you so much for spending some time tonight talking to us. And we encourage everybody to go out and purchase his book if you haven't already. Thanks, Dave.
thank you, Jared. Enjoyed it. Have a
Yes,
nice
sir.
night.